My neighbor thought she could use the police as her personal hit squad to shut down my family farm. But when the sirens arrived and she demanded they put me in handcuffs, the look on her face when I pulled out my federal credentials was absolutely devastating. She didn't just lose the argument. She lost her reputation, her savings, and eventually the very house she was trying to protect from my view. Before we get into this absolute insanity, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a satisfying story of justice served. The air in the valley was crisp, the kind of morning that makes you proud to be a rancher. But for me, that peace was short-lived. I had recently returned to my family's 100-acre cattle ranch in Montana after a 12-year career as a special agent for the Department of the Interior. My father's health was failing, and the legacy of 4 generations was on the line. I wasn't just there to play farmer. I was there to save our heritage. However, the world had changed since I left. The rolling hills bordering our eastern fence line had been swallowed up by a luxury development called Whispering Pines, a collection of multi-million-dollar glass boxes inhabited by people who wanted the aesthetic of the West without any of its reality. The ringleader of this group was Susan, the president of the Whispering Pines HOA. Susan was a woman who treated the entire county like it was her personal fiefdom. The very first day I pulled my old 1984 Chevy truck into the driveway, she was there. She didn't offer a pie or a welcome home. Instead, she blocked my horse trailer with her white European SUV and stepped out, clutching a clipboard like a weapon. She told me, without an ounce of irony, that my truck was a visual pollutant and that the fecal odors from my cattle were violating the air quality standards of the HOA. I explained as calmly as I could that my ranch was not, and had never been, part of her HOA. We were a sovereign agricultural entity that had been here since before her developers were born. She didn't like that. She told me that standards are evolving and that she had friends on the county board who could make my life very difficult. I told her to get off my gravel and went back to work. Over the next few weeks, the minor conflict turned into a campaign of psychological warfare. I would find HOA violation notices taped to my fence posts. I caught her using a drone to film my private backyard, claiming she was documenting animal cruelty because my cows were out in the rain. Every time I started my tractor, she'd call the local precinct to report a noise disturbance. It was petty, it was annoying, but I figured she'd eventually get bored and find a new victim. I was wrong. The cliffhanger came on a Tuesday morning when I found Susan and a group of surveyors standing 10 feet inside my property line, marking trees for removal. When I confronted her, she smirked and handed me a fraudulent easement document, claiming the HOA now owned a 30-foot buffer of my land for a nature trail. She told me I had 48 hours to move my fence, or they would do it for me and bill me for the labor. The situation exploded when I tore those survey markers out of the ground and told the crew to leave or be trespassed. Susan didn't scream this time. She just smiled a cold, calculated smile and pulled out her phone. She didn't call the HOA board. She called 911. But she didn't report a property dispute. I stood there in disbelief as I heard her tell the dispatcher that a crazed, armed man was threatening a work crew with a firearm and that she feared for her life. My heart hammered against my ribs. In a rural county, a man with a gun call brings every unit within 50 miles at top speed. I was wearing my work vest, which concealed my service weapon, a tool I'm legally required to carry as an active federal agent. But to the responding officers, I was just a threat. Within minutes, 5 cruisers tore up the dirt road, kicking up a wall of dust. Deputies bailed out with rifles leveled at my chest. I immediately went to the ground, hands laced behind my head, shouting that I was compliant. Susan was in the background, wailing for the cameras, putting on a performance for the ages. She was shouting, "He pointed it at me. He said he'd kill us all if we didn't give him his land." One deputy, a young guy with a chip on his shoulder named Miller, slammed his knee into my spine and cinched the plastic zip ties so tight my fingers went numb. He didn't ask questions. He started screaming about where the gun was. I tried to tell him I had credentials in my pocket, but he told me to shut my trap before he gave me a reason to. Susan stepped forward, her voice dripping with fake concern, and told the officers, "You really should just seize this whole place. It's a public menace. Look at the state of it." As Miller hauled me to my feet to throw me into the back of a hot cage, I saw my elderly father collapse on the porch from the stress. I was being kidnapped by the law on my own dirt, framed by a woman who wanted a better view for her morning coffee, and it looked like there was absolutely nothing I could do to stop it. The deputy slammed the door, and as the engine revved, Susan blew me a kiss through the window, convinced she had won the ranch once and for all. The silence in the back of the cruiser was deafening until we hit the end of the driveway. I finally managed to get Miller's attention through the partition. I told him, with a level of calm that clearly unnerved him, "Officer, you are currently detaining a federal agent on a false report. Reach into my front left pocket and look at the gold shield, or this is the last day you ever wear that uniform." He scoffed, but curiosity got the better of him. He pulled over, opened the door, and fished out my leather credential case. When he flipped it open and saw the Department of the Interior Special Agent badge and my federal ID, the blood drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint. He looked at the ID, then at the man with a gun report on his laptop, and realized he had just assaulted a federal officer based on the word of a known neighborhood nuisance. He cut the ties off immediately, apologizing so much he was tripping over his words. But I wasn't looking for an apology. I was looking for war. I walked back to the property line where Susan was still holding court with the other neighbors, bragging about how she had cleaned up the trash. When she saw me walking toward her, not in handcuffs, but flanked by the now terrified deputies, her jaw hit the grass. I didn't stop at the false report. I spent the next 72 hours using every federal resource at my disposal. As a DOI agent, I have access to historical geological surveys and water rights archives that the public never sees. I discovered a bombshell. When Susan's luxury development was built, they had illegally diverted a blue line protected stream to create a private lake for the HOA. Not only was this a massive federal Clean Water Act violation, but my survey proved that Susan's $1 million infinity pool and guest house were built exactly 12 feet onto my family's land due to a clerical error she had bribed a local official to overlook years ago. I didn't just have a badge, I had the power of the federal government to restore a waterway. I filed for an emergency federal injunction. 4 days later, a fleet of black SUVs and EPA investigators swarmed Whispering Pines. I walked onto Susan's patio with a federal marshal and handed her a seizure notice. Because her guest house was built on my land and her pool violated federal environmental protections, the court granted me an order for immediate remediation. I informed her that the federal government would be returning the stream to its natural course, which ran directly through her kitchen. The payback was a slow-motion wrecking ball. The first thing that happened was the lake. Because the diversion was illegal, the Army Corps of Engineers arrived to restore the natural flow. This meant Susan's backyard lake was drained in 48 hours, leaving behind a literal stinking mud pit filled with dead algae and mosquitoes. The property values in Whispering Pines plummeted overnight. Then came the criminal charges. Susan was indicted on federal charges for environmental destruction and state charges for filing a false police report and simulated assault via the police. The HOA, terrified of being tied to her, immediately stripped her of her presidency and sued her for the legal fees the neighborhood was now incurring. But the sweetest moment was the demolition. Since Susan couldn't afford to move to a guest house built of stone and glass, and I refused to grant an easement, the court ordered her to pay for its removal. I spent my Saturday morning sitting on a lawn chair at the fence line, sipping coffee, while a construction crew tore down the very building she used to spy on me. She stood on her remaining balcony, clutching a glass of wine at 10 a.m., watching her legacy turn into a pile of rubble. The county sheriff's office, embarrassed by the Miller incident, sent a personal apology from the sheriff himself, and they began patrolling my ranch specifically to ensure no HOA members set foot on my grass again. Susan tried to file for bankruptcy to avoid the fines, but federal environmental liens are non-dischargeable. She was trapped in a financial prison of her own making. The developer of Whispering Pines was also hit with a multi-million-dollar racketeering suit, and as they scrambled to save themselves, they turned over every email Susan had ever sent, revealing a decade-long pattern of bribery and land theft. The final nail in the coffin came 6 months later. Susan's husband divorced her after the lawsuits drained their retirement fund and the house went into foreclosure. Because the property was tainted by the environmental litigation and the fact that it no longer had a lake or a guest house, no one wanted it. I went to the courthouse steps and bought Susan's house for pennies on the dollar using the settlement money she owed me for the civil rights violation and the illegal encroachment. I didn't move in. I didn't rent it out. I called the local fire department and offered it to them for a controlled burn training exercise. I watched from my porch as the symbol of her arrogance went up in a controlled, glorious blaze. Once the ashes were cleared, I didn't rebuild. I tore up the foundation, hauled away the debris, and planted native Montana grass. I took down the Whispering Pines sign at the entrance of that section and replaced it with a sign that read, "Private ranch land, no trespassing." Today, my cattle grazed Susan's living room. The remaining neighbors are so terrified of me that they pull their cars over and wait for my cows to cross the road with smiles on their faces. They know that I'm not just a farmer. I'm the man who burned down a millionaire's dream with a gold shield and a property survey. Susan is now reportedly living in a cramped apartment 2 towns over, working a minimum wage job to pay off the interest on her federal fines. I heard she recently tried to complain about the noise of a neighbor's vacuum cleaner, but the landlord told her to move out if she didn't like it. My father is healthy, my cows are fat, and the stream is flowing exactly where it's supposed to, straight through the middle of my victory. I kept the brass doorknob from her front door as a paperweight on my desk, a reminder that no matter how loud Karen yells, she's no match for the truth and a federal badge. That was some serious high-stakes justice. If you enjoyed seeing that Karen got exactly what she deserved, make sure to subscribe and comment below with the word justice so I know you made it to the end. Don't forget to hit that notification bell for more insane stories just like this one.